You think you're the victim? My father's laugh cut through the silence like a blade. You're the reason she left. His words ricocheted in my skull, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. I froze, my throat dry, the coffee cup trembling in my hand. For a second, I wondered if I'd misheard him, if grief had made me hallucinate. But no. He was still staring at me, eyes burning with something I couldn't name, something far uglier than anger. I wanted to speak, to demand what he meant, but my lips wouldn't move. My chest ached, my pulse hammered, and suddenly the room felt smaller, suffocating. The reason she left? My mother's face flashed in my mind. The night she disappeared, the half-packed suitcase, the letter that never came. And now, years later, my father's voice had shattered everything I thought I knew. The morning after my father's words, I moved through the house as though wading through water. Every sound, the creak of the stairs, the hum of the refrigerator, even the faint rustle of leaves outside, felt amplified, mocking me with a kind of false calm. On the surface, everything looked ordinary, but inside me, nothing was. Our house sat at the end of a narrow lane, a 2-story structure painted in fading cream, its wooden shutters chipped by years of storms. To neighbors, it probably looked like any other home, quiet, modest, unremarkable. But to me, it had always carried the heaviness of a shrine where silence wasn't peace, it was punishment. Growing up here meant existing in a theater of roles. My father was the stern patriarch whose word carried the weight of law. My older brother, Daniel, was the golden child, athletic, charming, the boy who drew smiles without trying. And me? I was the shadow, the one who tried too hard, studied too late, and still somehow never measured up. I'd grown accustomed to the quiet humiliations, the forgotten birthdays, the praise that skipped over me like I wasn't in the room, the dinners where my words were drowned out by the clatter of cutlery and Daniel's endless stories. My mother used to soften it, her hand brushing my shoulder under the table, her eyes meeting mine with a subtle apology she never voiced. She was the only buffer between my father's coldness and my own growing resentment. And then, one night, she was gone. Don't dig into the past, my father had always said when I asked where she'd gone. It'll only poison you. But it had poisoned me anyway. I tried to focus on the mundane now, washing dishes, folding laundry, checking my phone for messages that never came. But each action carried the echo of my father's accusation. You're the reason she left. His laughter still rang in my ears. It hadn't been casual, nor had it been a slip of the tongue. It was deliberate, sharp, like a blade honed for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the worst part? He looked relieved saying it, as if he'd finally unburdened himself of a truth he'd kept hidden too long. I caught myself staring at my reflection in the window, the glass smudged from fingerprints. My own face looked foreign, as though I were a stranger trespassing in my own life. My hands were shaking again, and no matter how tightly I pressed them together, I couldn't stop. Was it possible? Had I been the reason? What could a child possibly have done to make a mother abandon her family? Normalcy had always been an illusion here, but now the cracks had widened into a chasm. Every room felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by unspoken things. And in the silence of that house, dread grew roots inside me, wrapping tighter with every passing hour. I knew this wasn't over. My father's words weren't the end of something. They were the beginning. It happened 2 nights later. I couldn't sleep, so I wandered into the attic, a place I rarely visited. The air up there was stale, thick with dust that clung to my throat. Cobwebs stretched across beams like abandoned curtains, and the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. My mother's things had been boxed away years ago, stacked neatly along one wall. Her books, her scarves, even her sewing machine. I wasn't looking for anything, not really, maybe just her ghost. But that's when I found it, a box I didn't recognize. Unlike the others, it wasn't labeled in her careful handwriting. It was shoved into the corner, half hidden behind an old trunk. My first thought was that it belonged to my father. He was secretive by nature, but the box had a strange pull, as though it wanted me to notice it. I knelt down, brushing off the dust. It wasn't locked, just taped shut. For a long moment I sat there, my hands hovering. Something in me knew that once I opened it, I couldn't close it again. Not the box, not the questions, not the wound it would open. When I finally tore the tape, the cardboard groaned as though protesting. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some of me, some of Daniel, a few of my father, but almost none of my mother. In fact, in the pictures where she should have been. Family vacations, birthdays, school plays. She was either cropped out or missing entirely. And then, buried beneath the stack, I found one that made my breath hitch. It was of me as a child, maybe 7 years old, standing on the front porch with my mother. She was crouched beside me, her arm around my shoulder, smiling at the camera. But scrawled across her face, in thick black marker, were the words, "She left because of you." The letters bled into the photo, jagged, violent, as though someone had carved them into the paper itself. My heart slammed against my ribs. I dropped the picture, my fingers trembling. The attic seemed smaller, the air heavier. Who had written that? My father? Daniel? Or was it my mother herself, leaving a message I was never meant to see? I scrambled through the rest of the box, but the contents only deepened the mystery. Letters with half the pages torn out. A birthday card to my father, signed only with an initial. A child's drawing, mine, ripped down the middle. Nothing made sense, and yet everything pointed back to me. That night, I sat on my bed, the photo clutched in my hands, staring at my mother's smile buried beneath the angry words. My father's voice echoed again. "You're the reason she left." Now, for the first time, I wondered if he wasn't just trying to hurt me. Maybe, in some twisted way, he was telling the truth. And the thought gnawed at me until dawn. The photograph haunted me for days. I carried it in my pocket like a curse, its edges fraying from my constant handling. The words scrawled across my mother's face weren't just ink anymore. They were a mirror, forcing me to confront the fractures of a childhood I had long pretended weren't there. My family had always looked perfect from the outside. My father was respected, a man of stern principles. My brother Daniel was the kind of son parents bragged about at dinner parties. Captain of the soccer team, a natural leader, handsome and confident in ways that made teachers overlook his flaws. And then there was me. Quieter, smaller, always second. If Daniel was the golden child, I was the tarnished one. It wasn't that I lacked ambition. I tried. I really did. I studied harder than Daniel, stayed up late memorizing equations, practicing speeches, rehearsing piano pieces until my fingers ached. But somehow, no matter how much effort I poured into everything, I never shone bright enough to catch my father's eye. I still remember the first time I realized the roles we had been cast in weren't temporary. I was 8. Daniel had scored the winning goal in a school match, and my father lifted him on his shoulders, cheering like a boy himself. When I tugged at his sleeve to tell him I'd won first place in the spelling bee, he glanced at me, muttered, "Good job," and turned back to Daniel. The warmth in his voice had vanished by the time it reached me. My mother noticed. She always noticed. At night, when the house was quiet, she'd come to my room and sit on the edge of my bed, smoothing my hair back from my forehead. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone," she'd whisper. "You're enough, just as you are." Her voice was a balm, but it was never enough to erase the sting of my father's indifference. Over time, I began to measure myself against Daniel in ways that twisted me inside. His report cards were pinned to the refrigerator, mine slipped into a drawer. His trophies were polished and displayed. Mine collected dust in a box under the stairs. But the worst part wasn't the neglect. It was the blame. Whenever something went wrong in the house, the weight somehow fell on me. If Daniel got into trouble at school, my father turned to me. "Why didn't you keep him focused?" If my mother seemed tired or withdrawn, he'd snap, "Can't you make things easier for her? You're always so demanding." I was the scapegoat, the lightning rod for every frustration they didn't want to direct at Daniel. At first I resisted, crying, arguing, trying to prove my innocence. But children learn quickly where resistance gets them. By the time I was 12, I stopped protesting. Silence became my shield. And then came the night my mother left. I don't remember the sound of the door closing. What I remember is the silence that followed. A silence so sharp it cut the air like glass. My father didn't explain. Daniel didn't ask. It was as though she had never existed. Her clothes vanished from the closet, her photos from the walls, her laughter from the halls. When I asked my father where she was, his eyes hardened. "She's gone," he said flatly, "and don't you dare bring her up again." I was 14, too young to understand, too old not to feel the sting of abandonment. But I remember the last time I saw her. She had been standing at the kitchen sink, her back to me, shoulders hunched. I'd walked in, carrying a crumpled math test I'd failed. My voice shook as I asked her for help. She turned, her eyes rimmed red, and said nothing. She simply knelt, wrapped her arms around me, and whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't know what she was apologizing for. I still don't. In the years that followed, I learned to live in that silence. My father buried himself in work, Daniel in his effortless charm, and I became the ghost of the house. I went to school, did my chores, drifted through days like an afterthought. But even ghosts have memories. The photograph in the attic wasn't just an artifact, it was a wound reopening. Those words, "She left because of you," felt like the culmination of everything I'd always feared, but never dared to say aloud. Because what if it was true? What if my mother, fragile as she was, had finally broken under the weight of me, my neediness, my failures, my inability to make this fractured family whole? What if my existence had tipped her over the edge, and walking away had been her only escape? The thought was unbearable, and yet it explained everything. It explained my father's bitterness. It explained Daniel's smug superiority. It explained why my mother's absence was never spoken of, as though her very name had been scrubbed from the walls. For the first time, I didn't just feel like the scapegoat, I felt like the cause. And that belief, that poisoned seed, began to grow roots in me, curling into every memory, rewriting every moment. Maybe I was the reason she left. The more I stared at that photograph, the more the inked words began to shift in my mind. They weren't just an accusation, they were a message. But from who? And why now, after all these years? I kept the photo hidden in a notebook, carrying it everywhere like a secret talisman. At work, at the grocery store, even when I went for runs. It was irrational, but I felt as though if I let it out of my sight, someone might snatch it back, as if the truth it contained wasn't meant for me. Then, one afternoon, as I flipped the picture over, I noticed something I hadn't before. Faint, almost invisible handwriting on the back. The ink had faded, but under the lamp's glow, I could just make out the words, "Not your fault." Find the letters. My breath caught. Letters? Which letters? I spent hours that night tearing through the attic again, searching through every box, every envelope, every scrap of paper. I found nothing. Frustration boiled in me until I kicked one of the trunks, sending it sliding across the floor. That's when I heard the rattle, something small shifting inside. I pried it open. Beneath old linens and a stack of yearbooks lay a thin, battered envelope, yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were 3 letters, written in my mother's handwriting. The first was addressed to me. "My sweet child, I want you to know I love you more than life itself. Nothing you did could ever drive me away. I am leaving because I can't survive here anymore. The weight is too heavy, and your father's anger is not yours to carry. If one day you find this, believe me, it was never you." I reread the words until the letters blurred with tears. A fragile hope sparked in my chest, battling the years of poison I had swallowed. The second letter was addressed to Daniel, but it wasn't filled with the same tenderness. Instead, it was clipped, almost harsh. "You have learned too well from your father. Charm without conscience is cruelty. I hope one day you'll understand the cost of silence." And the third, half finished, the ink smudged, was to my father. "You will blame anyone but yourself. But you know why I am gone. You know the page ended there." I sat in the dust, my hands trembling around the fragile paper. The words shifted everything. My father's accusations, Daniel's smirks, my own guilt. They weren't the truth. They were the story they wanted me to believe. But why? Why blame me? That night, lying awake, I remembered something, a sound. It had been buried deep, but now it returned with startling clarity. The night my mother left, I'd heard muffled voices downstairs. My father's low growl, my mother's sharp, broken sobs, and then Daniel's voice. Cold, calculating. You'll ruin everything. At the time, I hadn't understood. I'd convinced myself I'd dreamed it. But now, with the letters in hand, it felt less like memory and more like confession. The pieces began to click into place, though the picture they formed was darker than I wanted to admit. My father hadn't just blamed me. He needed me to carry the guilt, so Daniel remained untouched, the shining sun, the unbroken facade. And Daniel? He had known, maybe even helped. The thought made my stomach churn. The photograph had been defaced for a reason. The truth had been buried for a reason. And suddenly, I realized something terrifying. If my mother had left because of them, then my father and brother had spent years ensuring I never discovered it. And now I had. I couldn't keep the letters hidden for long. They burned inside me, begging to be spoken aloud, to shatter the silence that had suffocated me for years. I knew I couldn't go to Daniel. His smirk alone would twist any truth into mockery. So I went to my father. It was late evening when I found him in his study. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke and old leather, the curtains drawn tight against the world outside. He was seated behind his desk, glasses perched low, pretending to read the newspaper. I placed the envelope in front of him. He didn't even look up. "What's this?" "Open it," I said, my voice tighter than I expected. When he saw the handwriting, his face flickered, just for a second, but I caught it. Recognition. Fear. Slowly, he slid the first letter out, the one addressed to me. His lips moved as he read, but his expression hardened, like stone closing over water. When he was finished, he tossed it aside. "She was weak," he muttered, "always too emotional." My pulse raced. "That letter proves everything you said to me was a lie. She didn't leave because of me. She left because of you." His eyes snapped up, sharp and cold. "Careful." "No," I said, surprising even myself. "I've carried your blame long enough." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Do you really think those scraps of paper mean anything?" "She was unstable. She wrote all sorts of nonsense. And you've always been gullible enough to believe anything if it makes you feel important." The gaslighting was so swift, so precise, it nearly knocked the air out of me. My chest tightened, the old reflex to shrink back clawing its way up, but I forced myself to stand still. "She wrote to Daniel too," I said quietly, "and to you." That got his attention. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his cheek twitching. "You've been snooping where you don't belong," he said finally, his voice low, dangerous. "I was a child," I snapped. "You made me believe I drove her away. You let me rot under that guilt while Daniel basked in your light." He rose then, slowly, deliberately, as if he wanted me to feel the full weight of his presence. He wasn't tall, but in that moment he loomed, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the room. "You were easier to break," he said simply. "Daniel needed to be built up. You? You could absorb it. You always did." The honesty in his voice chilled me more than any lie. "So you chose me," I whispered. He smiled, if you could call it that. A cruel twist of his mouth. "Someone had to carry it. Better you than him." For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The truth wasn't just that I had been scapegoated. It was that it had been deliberate, calculated. I gathered the letters, my hands trembling. "You don't get to decide that anymore." As I turned to leave, his voice followed me, dripping venom. "You'll destroy yourself chasing ghosts. She's gone. And if you dig too deep, you'll end up just like her." I froze at the door, my mother's whispered, "I'm sorry," echoing in my memory. Maybe he was right. Maybe the past could destroy me. But maybe, just maybe, it could free me too. The letters weighed heavier in my pocket than any stone. My father's words haunted me, his sneering certainty that I was easier to break, and maybe I had been. But something inside me shifted in that moment, as though a locked door had finally splintered. The next morning, I called Daniel. He answered on the third ring, his voice lazy, amused. "Well, if it isn't the family ghost." "What do you want?" "I found something," I said. "About Mom." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "Still clinging to her, huh?" "You never could let go." I clenched my jaw. "She didn't leave because of me. She wrote letters. To me, to you, to Dad." Another silence, sharper this time. When he spoke again, his tone was edged with annoyance. "You shouldn't have gone digging." "That's what Dad said," I shot back, almost word for word. For the first time in years, I had caught Daniel off guard. I could hear it in the hesitation, the faint exhale, the way his confidence faltered. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into," he said finally. "Mom couldn't handle it. She was fragile. You were her excuse, that's all." But the words rang hollow, rehearsed. "You told her she'd ruin everything," I said, the memory bursting into clarity. "I heard you." That night, the silence on the line stretched long, suffocating. Then, a low laugh, not amused, but bitter. "So you did remember." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "You knew." "You let me believe." "I did what I had to," Daniel cut in, sharp now, defensive. "Dad made it clear, if she stayed, everything we had would collapse. His job, his reputation, the whole facade. She was threatening to expose it all. You think I was going to let her drag us down because she couldn't stomach the truth?" My pulse thundered. The truth about what? But he didn't answer. He hung up. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, the line dead. My hands shook as I lowered it, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened screen. It wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just favoritism. My family had built their lives on lies, and I had been the sacrificial lamb to keep it intact. For a long time, I considered what to do. Expose them? Burn it all down? I imagined showing the letters to the world, dragging their names through the mud, reclaiming the years they had stolen. But then I thought of my mother, her soft hands smoothing my hair, her whispered, "You're enough." She hadn't written those letters to start a war. She'd written them to set me free. So I made a different choice. That evening, I walked through the house one final time. I carried the letters in a small tin box, pressed close to my chest. My father sat in his chair, pretending to read, the same as always. Daniel's laughter echoed faintly from the phone in his hand. I didn't speak to either of them. I didn't need to. At the doorway, I paused, looking back at the walls that had caged me, at the shadows that had stolen my childhood. "She didn't leave because of me," I said quietly, not to them, but to myself, to the child I once was, to the ghost that still lived here. Then I stepped out into the night, closing the door behind me. Not justice, not revenge, something quieter, sharper, escape. The air outside felt different, thinner, lighter, like I had finally stepped out of a storm I'd been trapped in for years without knowing it. The night sky stretched above me, dark but endless, scattered with faint stars. For the first time in a long while, I lifted my head and let myself breathe. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I simply walked, the letters pressed close to my chest, a fragile shield against the poison I was leaving behind. Each step away from that house was a step toward myself, the self that had been buried under blame, under silence, under someone else's story. My father's laughter still echoed in my mind. Daniel's voice still lingered like smoke, but their words no longer carried the same weight. They were chains, yes, but chains I had chosen, unknowingly, to wear. And chains, once recognized, can be broken. As I reached the edge of the street, I stopped and looked back one last time. The house stood there in shadow, its windows blank and hollow. I thought of my mother, her apologies, her absence, her love hidden in letters I wasn't supposed to find. Maybe she had run, maybe she had collapsed, maybe she had simply chosen herself after years of drowning. And me? I wasn't sure yet. Was walking away justice or cowardice? Was silence a victory or just another kind of surrender? I only knew this. I would no longer carry a guilt that was never mine. The night air was cool on my skin as I whispered into the dark. She left because of you, but I'm leaving because of me. And for the first time, it felt like enough.